and we're getting more into the details of the Carlton Complex fires from last summer, specifically looking at the forests and looking at the forest from a forest ecology, fire ecology perspective in general, and then also getting into more of the interaction of fire with disease and pathogens. And we have two speakers. The first one tonight is Susan Prichard, who works for the University of Washington through a cooperative agreement with the Forest Service Sciences Research Pacific Northwest Research Station Lab in Seattle. And Susan lives here, happens to be my partner as well, and has done a lot of local work too in terms of fire research on the tripod, and presumably we'll do more with the Carlton Complex fire. And then our second speaker is Connie Mehmel, who's a forest entomologist in Wenatchee with the Forest Service Research Lab or Science, what is it?
Actually, with the National Forest.
With the National Forest. And Connie used to live and work here in the valley. So on to Susan.
So I'm going to start out by giving a review of the Carlton Complex fires. I'm in a little bit of a unique position because we all survived the Carlton Complex fires, and I'm actually kind of surprised that as many people actually wanted to assemble and talk about the fires as did. But I'm also a fire ecologist, so I live full-time in the Methow Valley, and then also kind of reconstructing and interpreting what happened in the summer, and I'll probably be doing this for some years along with Connie and Paul and others. So with that, I've got to figure out my setup here. I'm not used to bending down to do slides. I'm just going to first start out with an overview, kind of go through and talk through the days that set up the Carlton Complex fires and why it's such an unusual fire. Why, even for a fire ecologist, I was blown away by this event, and I'm still kind of scratching my head about it. And then we're going to move into the meat of the talk, which is about how a lot of our dry forest ecosystems have plants that are very adapted to fire. We can even call them fire dependent. They need fire. And so with that, we're going to talk about how they are adapted to fire and how they'll work with even this high severity extreme event, the Carlton Complex. We're also going to then talk about recovery of the landscapes. I'm going to start out first with upland forests and the ponderosa pine and Douglas fir forests, and then talk some about our riparian forests. And then finally, it's not a talk these days without mentioning climate change. And so we really need to put vegetation recovery in the context of a warmer world. So we'll spend a little bit of time on that, but not too much doom and gloom, I promise. And then
That's my presentation.
that is Connie's presentation. Just to let you know, Connie, you're not ready. You know, if you want to get a glass of wine, you still have an hour. So, but anyway, Connie and I have actually spoken together before and gone on field trips together. So it's a really a great honor to share this evening with her. And given that I'm also speaking about upland forests, this is going to dovetail very nicely to talk about the native insects and pathogens in the forest. Okay. So starting out, I just wanted to say that our regular haunts, one of them for me is Pipestone Canyon, are changed. You know, some of you, I'm sure, in the audience have your homes and your surroundings very changed. And I just put up Pipestone Canyon as one example of a place that I go to fairly regularly, and each time I go there I think, this is now going to be different for the rest of my life. And that's a pretty amazing thing to think about, actually. And so with that, I was able to talk with Fred Wirt, and he gave me some video of overflights of Pipestone Canyon. I figured we'd start there. And then he also flew the entire valley, and so I have a little clip of Benson Creek up through Wenner Lakes and into Finley Canyon that I was just going to share. But my goal here is to kind of just give you that bird's eye view, transitioning from Paul Hesburgh's talk, where he really was talking about landscapes than to more on the ground. Well, moving on then, again, taking the landscape view, is that we've had a lot of fire in the Mehmel Valley and the surrounding areas in the last 20 years. I thought about this right after the Carlton complex, and I really wanted to see puzzle piece-wise how it fit in with the other fire events. And so I brought the past fires up in GIS and put them together. And this is what we have. I believe I have a pointer here. So we had the tripod complex in 2006. Before that, actually, this fire was around 180,000 acres in size. Before that, we actually had Farewell, which was a big fire in its own right, around 80,000 acres. And then here we have the Carlton complex fires. I don't have Rising Eagle quite yet, so I'll add that to the map later on. But you can just see that, you know, it fit in at the south end on Tripod. And then we have the Needles fire, and we also had Tattoos at the same time as Tripod, and then a bunch down in Lake Chelan. So we have a really different landscape all of a sudden. 20 years of fire have really created a lot of regenerating forest, regenerating shrubland. So pretty striking. Okay, now on to what was so unusual in terms of fire spread about this Carlton complex event. I forgot to mention that, I'm going to go back actually. In this slide, a lot of the previous fires that we had, especially around Winthrop and Mazama, have been forest fires. And one of the unusual things about the Carlton complex was how much it burned in the shrub steppe. And when I move on to the progression layers, that's part of the reasons why we saw such rapid progression of this fire. So I've got a few numbers here. On July 15th, there were a couple different fires, and as I'm sure many of you know, there were the ones right around Carlton, Stokes Road, and then there was also the Cougar Flats that occurred right around the same time. Both of the happened in the lightning strikes of that previous Sunday. So by Thursday morning, things really started happening. And I'm just going to set the stage. Many of you lived through this, so you know. We had about 8 days prior to the lightning strikes that started these fires of extremely hot, dry weather. Temperatures were above 100 degrees. Relative humidities were in the low teens. And so our forests and shrublands were tinder boxes. I think a lot of us were kind of nervous about those lightning strikes and went, "Ew, that's not good." And then in the morning of that Thursday morning, the 17th, we had the strong winds. And they were really strong. At the North Cascade Smoke Jumpers base, they recorded peak gusts at around 30 to 35 miles per hour. Some people observed that wind speeds up on ridge tops were even a lot higher. So we had ripping winds from, you guessed it, this is basically the upper valley down towards the Columbia River. So what happened was basically this Cougar Flats fire started going, and wow did it ever, right along with the Carlton Stokes Road fires. And so basically from the morning of the 17th, the fire grew, I think it was about 40,000 acres in size until about 3 p.m. And then the main spread, it's amazing acreage, it grew 123,000 acres that afternoon and evening. One of the unusual, I keep on saying unusual because it was so unusual, was the unusual thing about it was that the relative humidities never really came up that evening. It was still dry, hot, and the winds blew all the way to about midnight. So we had this incredible growth, and it was scary. I mean, I know many of us were super scared about the people in the Taros and Brewster and how they were going to get out of there in time. So really rapid spread rates. Here's just a few firefighter photos that I was able to get, and these show what we kind of typically see in a shrub steppe fire. which is surface fire. Here's the flaming front. Actually, this is kind of the flanky fire coming down slope. And here's kind of what you would imagine, or what you would see in terms of flame lengths. Pretty high flame lengths. There's wind behind these for sure. But you would expect in this type of fire, or I would, that a lot of trees would survive because it's a surface fire. So you would expect maybe 20, 30% of the trees could be killed perhaps, but a lot of them would survive. One of the things that we had in the Carlton complex fires was an ember-driven fire front. And what I mean by that is that those strong winds align with our valley, and they just pushed the column of smoke straight down towards Pateros and Brewster. And with that smoke came this incredible rain of embers. I was really glad to get this photo of just showing how many sparks, how many firebrands were actually in the sky that night. And what they basically did was pre-ignite the fuels ahead of the flaming front of the fire. So what I mean by the flaming front again is we can see here, whoops, sorry, I went the wrong way. We can see here that we've got this line of fire, and that's marching down valley, right? But we also have those embers and the preheated air pushing forward ahead of the fire, and there are mass ignitions in the head of that flaming front. One of the other photos that I was able to get, these were from, oh my gosh, I'm forgetting her name, sorry, it should be right down there. But,
Kristen Wall.
Kristen Wall, thank you. So she had these photos on her blog, and one of them is right around Gold Creek. Does this look familiar to you? It's an old wooden aqueduct, I believe, along the rocks. And there's rock and water all around the structure, and it's really these embers that ignited it. Couldn't have been anything else. Another feature that we see everywhere in our valley are these lone ponderosa pines, or really sparsely populated ponderosa pines that succumb to the fire. You can see, this is a little bit hard to see, but all of these trees still have their needles on, or a lot of them do, and it was the heat, the scorch of these fires that killed them. And again, it was that column of smoke probably preheating, pre-igniting fuels that actually made them succumb when we would not normally expect them to. I didn't want to do too many of these dramatic photos. The news media did plenty, but I just wanted to mention that, you know, a lot of the houses that burned were surrounded by plenty of green space. This is a photo of Pateros area, and again, the embers of this fire, the wind-driven embers, were responsible for a lot of the structure fires that occurred. Here's a photo just on fire severity. This one blew me away. Alta Lake. So here's a golf course. Not surprisingly, we see that a lot of the golf course is still green. That's something I would expect. It's well irrigated. It wouldn't be particularly flammable, even in such an extreme fire event. However, I would have never guessed that well-irrigated apple and pear orchards would have actually burned in the fire. So every time we see this black color in a photo, that means that the vegetation actually was consumed by the fire. It wasn't just scorched. Brown is basically where it was scorched and preheated and killed, but not actually burned. But that's pretty intense, that these orchards actually around the fringes burned by these fires. And here's a photo of Upper Finley Canyon. So we got here, this would make a really great bike ride for any of you guys. We're going to probably take our kids up here next spring. But you could start on the South Summit Road and then work your way down to this vista. And one of the things as ecologists that really struck me and my colleagues when we were here is that there's not a single ponderosa pine that's still living in this landscape. It's a huge area and 100% mortality. All right, so I did a bunch of research in the Drip Pod Fire. And a lot of it had to do with how extreme the tripod fire event was. It also was a pretty wind-driven event that happened in a particularly dry summer. And one of the questions that I asked with my research was how areas that had been prescribed burned fared in the tripod fire. And we would have expected actually not so well. And it was really interesting in the study to see that because this is an old clear cut, because there was broadcast burning in this area, there were just not enough surface fuels to actually carry fire through this old unit. You can see that there was standard placing fire all around this unit, and yet this was protected by prescribed burning. We also saw that very frequently in thin and prescribed burn units. This is what I grew to expect to see in the tripod landscape. These green islands in a field of black because there had been field treatments. I'll skip that slide actually, I don't think we need it. And I'll just move on to this one. We didn't find that in the Carlton complex. So Meg Chabon, who's a colleague of mine, did a preliminary survey of how well their thinning and prescribed burning worked in the Carlton complex. And what they found was that only about 20% of the treatment units, these were mostly prescribed burn units, fared well, had low severity. And we all know what low severity means now. And those were located in areas where the fire was flanking, so it wasn't that column-driven head of the fire, it was along the edges, along the less intense edges of the fire where we found that the treatments held or worked. And then there was about mixed severity in 35%, and then 45% of the treatments had no effect. So anyway, this is something I'm going to talk with Connie and others about because we need to do more research. It's just kind of showing us that there's a threshold, there's a type of fire that's too extreme for a lot of our treatments to work. All right, so that's the introduction. I just wanted to share why this fire was so unusual for those of us in the fire world. Now we're going to talk about some plant adaptations, and it should get a lot more cheerful and less doom and gloom at this point. So there's basically 4 adaptations, at least I'm kind of summarizing the world into 4 main adaptations to fire. The first have our charismatic megaflora in them, and these would be called the resistors. And so resistors are known especially to be like ponderosa pine. Ponderosa pine around here gets all the credit, but I have to say that western larch is even better as a resistor. And it's because they have this really thick bark, especially when they're mature. And the bark has grooves, the bark actually flakes off little flakes in a fire. And so there's lots of ways that the tree is either shedding the fire or resisting the fire through thick bark to help them to survive. Now any tree that actually gets crowned, where it actually the fire transitions into the canopy, will be killed. But these trees tend to shed their lower branches, so there's lower probability of a fire transitioning into a crown fire. And so they can survive even kind of moderate intensity fires. So you could imagine even a flame length of 10 feet would not really harm the resistors in the left side of the photo. Now to talk about the endurers, I think I even like these better. These are so cool. So these are a bunch of shrubs, herbs, and deciduous trees whose strategy, if you will, is to allow themselves to be top killed by a fire. Most often the top of the plant is fully consumed or killed by the fire, but they have either roots or a basal crown around the roots that will sprout following the fire. One of my favorite examples of this is Ceanothus here. It's not working, is it? There we go. Snowbrush. So this species is an endurer in 2 different ways. First of all, it can withstand pretty intense fires and still sprout. So it's very sturdy in that way. And then it also has an incredibly long-lived seed bank. There's been studies that have shown that a forest that doesn't have any snowbrush in the understory, much too dense for snowbrush, that's over 100 years, pushing 200 years old, can be burned. And what comes up afterwards? Snow brush. So these seeds can last, I've heard, up to 200 years in the soil and then come around again. Now, another one of our categories are all types of willow. And so these plants actually sprout through lateral sucker roots that will allow them to sprout. So aspen and willow can come back. And in much the same way, there might be a stand pretty much dominated by conifers, where you wouldn't even really think aspen had much of a foothold in there. And old roots of aspen can then sprout back after these fires. So not through the seeds, but through the roots. A lot of our shrub steppe species also are endurers. So I'm actually expecting them to do quite well following these fires. The native bunch grasses, hog balsam root, desert parsley, many species are going to come right back following these fires. Now we have the invaders. Some of these are native invaders. I'm going to cover these first. So I imagine you guys can recognize this even though it's a little fuzzy. What's this plant species? Fireweed. Yeah. So again, pretty long-leaved seed bank in the soils, and we see that in many areas, especially where the soils are moist enough to support fireweed following fire. What's this species? Lodgepole pine. Wow. It is both an invader because, wow, it can seed in a site, but it's also an endurer. And it's an endurer because it has some seeds, not all, are serotinous. The cones are serotinous, and so it's got this aerial seed bank, which is awfully convenient after a standard placing fire comes in. The fire will actually heat those cones, allow them to open, and then lodgepole pine will rain down very densely often and regenerate again. So both an invader and an endurer. Unfortunately, all of our non-native weeds that we work so hard to pull out of our properties are perfect invaders. So we have a bunch of those, and we'll get into those a little bit later. All right. Now our fourth category is not really a fair category. It's almost a catch-all. We call them avoiders or not fire adapted, and I don't think that's quite fair for a couple reasons. These would include our high elevation conifer species such as subalpine fir, Engelmann spruce, others for sure. And all of them are characterized by having very thin bark. So don't seem like they would avoid fire in the sense that they've got pretty long fire return intervals in these ecosystems. The reason I say that it's a little unfair to say that they're not fire adapted is that all of those tree species do best regenerating in mineral soil. And so episodic fire actually helps them renew, or landslides, avalanche tracks. There's lots of different ways to open up that mineral soil, but they do regenerate best with that. Okay, so moving on to vegetation recovery. So the resistors are the most interesting category for me. I've already kind of given away the punchline for the endurers. I think they're going to do very well, thank you very much. But the resistors tend to have a different strategy than a high severity fire. I'll get into this a little bit. Here are ponderosa pine doing what I think they do best. So here's a couple ponderosa pine off of Leicester Road. They've been scorched. You see the brown foliage here. So that means that the fire was very intense, but it actually didn't crown into these trees. We would see the black outlines of branches if it actually crowned. But these trees have been killed. The foliage has been killed all the way up to here. So about, I would guess, 70–80% of these crowns have been damaged. And these branches won't sprout back. They are now dead. However, ponderosa pine can handle a lot of scorching. And my bet's with these two trees, I bet they'll actually survive. What do you think, Connie?
Have to look a little closer.
Yeah, and she'll talk a little bit more about that, I'm sure. And then again, here we can see that there's definitely been some of these trees where you see if the scorch is all the way to the top, they're definitely mostly dead. But the ones that have green crowns will probably survive. So that's being a resistor. I'm going to back up and just talk a little bit about the changes that we've observed in the ponderosa pine low elevation forest. Someone in the audience last week asked about forest succession. Is that gentleman here? I don't think he is. Oh, there you are. Great. So anyway, I'm going to talk a little bit about forest succession. The way that we describe that in ecology is a little bit like kings and queens succeeding power. So starting out with a standard placing fire, here we had a high severity fire event right here. The first dominant species we'd expect on the site would be fireweed and early invaders, but they would be quickly taken over by young trees. And then as time marches on, in this forest from western Washington, Douglas fir would rule for a long time until many of those stems would finally get old. Douglas fir is very long-lived, and so when the canopy started opening up way over here in late old growth stage, then we would expect some of the co-dominant species such as western hemlock and western red cedar to be able to come up in the understory because they're shade tolerant and can handle the low light, and then finally take over the stand in the absence of fire. So when we talk about succession or stand development, that's oftentimes what we're talking about. Now, I have a much less appealing diagram, although I think it's quite good. And I'll go through this. This would be more for our ponderosa pine forests. So starting out after, say, standard placing fire, we could enter in a grass phase. And then quickly the grass would hopefully be taken over by ponderosa pine and Doug fir, PP for ponderosa pine, DF for Doug fir. And then in the absence of fire, much like in Douglas fir in the western Washington, stand development would come into maturity, and then over time, Douglas fir would be the dominant one in this landscape because it's actually a little shade tolerant compared to ponderosa pine. However, fortunately for us, we would hopefully have a lot of light surface fires. And with that, every time that a stand at any of these stages got a surface fire, it would actually benefit ponderosa pine. So over time, with multiple fires, we end up more with the ponderosa pine dominated landscape. So it's actually a fire-maintained ecosystem. This slide probably isn't very good, but I really like it. It shows repeat photography from early 1900s in ponderosa pine. And this is actually a controversial photograph because it's supposed to represent historic conditions, but if you look really closely, there's actually piles. And so so back in 1909, this actually had some thinning, and they actually were piling and burning, which is kind of interesting. But then, 1948 and 1989 represent what we often see in ponderosa pine country these days, the infilling of friendly fir, or not so friendly fir, as we get into here. And so I know Paul already covered this, but I just wanted to talk about forest succession a little bit more and show that in the absence of fire, these forests are succeeding to Douglas fir. Here's just one more photo. I like this one, just showing an old farmhouse in 1895 versus 1980. I'm sure you're convinced. Okay. So now coming back to our resistor, ponderosa pine, I could say the same thing for our western larch, where we have western larch in some ways. But ponderosa pine has a challenge to regenerate at this point. And the reason why is because it is a good cone crop every 4 to 5 years. It actually takes 2 growing seasons, 2 summers for its cones to fully mature. And so there's a pulse of good seeds every 4 to 5 years. Now, interesting, the seeds don't survive like snowbrush. They only survive in the soil for 1 to 2 years. They also have really short dispersal because these seeds are heavy. They pack a punch, but they don't travel very far. Small mammals certainly help, but in terms of falling from a tree, it's just about a 3.5 crown in distance for dispersal. And so the strategy that it follows is really one that some of those trees are going to survive and reseed the site. In photos such as this, that's where we start worrying, because this was a ponderosa pine dominated stand. Denser than historic, but there's a regeneration problem for ponderosa pine here, and it will probably take a very long time. Possibly Douglas fir with wind-borne seeds might have an advantage. Another question that we have management-wise is that a lot of these fire-affected forests are very dense, and one question I even hesitate to mention it because I'm not a really big fan of salvage, but this is a published paper from our colleague Dave Peterson in Wenatchee. There's simply pools of fuels. What I mean by fuels is logging, well not logging slash, but slash from the falling trees from a fire-affected forest. So following fire, right around 20 years, there's a pulse of fine fuels, medium fuels, large fuels. And if we get another fire in stands right around 20 years, that's really hard on ponderosa pine because whatever trees do manage to regenerate would be very vulnerable to a high intensity fire in that slash. So interesting questions, interesting dilemmas for what to do.